So this is Roundstone Bog, and it's quite an extensive area of lowland Atlantic blanket bog, which is nestled between the mountains and the coast here in western Connemara, just south of Clifton. This is somewhat of a hidden gem in Connemara, and unfortunately we don't have many areas in the country left like this of extensive areas of relatively intact blanket bog. And its saving grace is probably the fact that it is so remote and largely inaccessible. And there was previously plans to try and improve the site to drain it, but thankfully those plans never materialised because of the difficulties it would have taken to do so. And now what we have remaining is so important. And Roundstone Bog is definitely not without its pressures, and a lot of the factors that affect our biodiversity are evident here as they are in other parts of Connemara.
So this area here would be a special protection area for birds, and a special area of conservation for the habitats, the peatland habitats. In general, it's in pretty good state, especially in the core area of the bog. Now there are some issues around the periphery of the bog where it's a bit more accessible. So we have still issues with turf cutting, which still takes place here. We've also issues with grazing. Sometimes grazing is a bit too much, so the habitat can suffer. With turf cutting, it's more so the drainage associated with these works, and obviously draining on peatlands is not a good idea. It destroys the habitat, it releases carbon into the atmosphere. There's also other issues, with invasive species. Rhododendron is starting to become an issue in some areas, and it's even starting to pop out on out in the middle of the bog and some of the islands as well.
It's one of the most extensive areas in Connemara, and probably one of the most extensive areas of blanket bog nationally that is largely untouched or unaffected by afforestation. And that allows us that when we look around we have these wide open expansive views, and that's not very common with our blanket bogs anymore because a lot of them have been planted. But there is woodland on the bog, and these are in the form of these densely wooded islands on the lochs on the bog.
The islands here, they're kind of a stark contrast to the open peatland landscape that we have here. So yeah, they kind of serve as little oases almost of refuges of native woodland. So you're going to get some lovely native trees like sessile oak, downy birch, the mountain ash, willow, and also yew is actually particularly common on a lot of these islands, and it's pretty much absent on the mainland, and that's primarily down to grazing. So obviously the sheep can't reach out there. We've had red deer now have reappeared on the landscape here in the last 2 decades, and especially in the northern end of the bog here now we're starting to notice the effects of red deer, because red deer will swim out to these islands and will browse and will have an effect on them. But yeah, the islands, they're fantastic little spots.
But it is easy to look at Roundstone Bog and to think that there's not a lot going on here. You can come out and visit and not see a huge amount in terms of the wildlife, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. And a lot of the species and wildlife that occur here, they conceal themselves incredibly well and they blend into the bog. So there's 2 species that are really synonymous with Roundstone Bog, and that's golden plover and merlin. And Roundstone Bog is actually one of the most important places in the country for both of those species, for their populations. Golden plover is a breeding wader that nests on the ground. Their populations are unfortunately in decline, and quite a limited population, very much restricted to blanket bogs along the west coast. And here in Roundstone Bog actually holds the highest numbers of golden plover. They can seem incredibly vulnerable just nesting out in the open on the ground to predation, to other pressures. but they're masterful camouflage. They simply blend into their surroundings, into the bog, and that is their defence mechanism to allow them to survive and to allow them to nest in such vulnerable locations. The merlin as well, Roundstone Bog always holds a number of pairs of merlin each breeding season, and they nest typically on the densely wooded islands on the bog, and they're ideal nest sites. They don't build a nest themselves, they use old hooded crow nests, and they require healthy bird populations as prey species. So the likes of meadow pipit and skylark, which obviously live in the surrounding blanket bog, and merlin need healthy blanket bogs that can support good numbers of these birds, or otherwise they wouldn't be here in the first place. They can't survive. So to have still healthy populations of golden plover and merlin in Roundstone Bog is really important, is incredible, but we need to make sure that they remain, because they're incredibly vulnerable species, and elsewhere in the country unfortunately their populations aren't faring as well and are very much in decline. Roundstone Bog as well, really important for other breeding waders. So we have common sandpiper typically nesting at the edge of the lakes or on some of the islands, as well as very small numbers of redshank. Snipe also breed in Roundstone Bog, and breeding waders really are a group that are very much in trouble. Most breeding waders are in decline and are to the point that they're endangered. So the Roundstone Bog supports many of these, most of them red listed birds. Conservation concern is really important. Also red grouse as well occur in quite low numbers, but they are present throughout Roundstone Bog, and as well species like kestrel, like some of the ducks. We have tufted duck, teal as well in Roundstone Bog. So for birds, and particularly for birds of conservation concern, it's an incredibly important site.
It's a designated special protection area for 4 species, which would include the merlin falcon, the golden plover, the cormorant and common gull. And all of these are generally breeding birds here in the bogs. Most of those species would leave here during the winter time. If you think about the curlew, which gets a lot of attention, curlew would have been common breeders here in Connemara, not just in Roundstone Bog. They've largely gone from Connemara now. You've also got species like the Greenland white-fronted goose, which was a winter visitor here. It was one of the few species that would have utilised this site during the winter time. And Greenland white-fronted geese now have largely gone in the last 2 or 3 decades. We're finding in recent years now they're actually getting replaced by greylag geese, which were actually released from a feral population. So they breed on the islands here during the summer time. And in time they might have an effect on the ecosystem here as well. Going way back in the past, a century, 2 centuries ago, species like white-tailed eagle and marsh harrier would have bred quite commonly here. Now, thankfully, we are seeing the return of the white-tailed eagle, and there has been a breeding attempt by white-tailed eagle here in Roundstone Bog in the past, and there are other younger birds knocking around in the area. So fingers crossed they'll return.
So here in Roundstone as well, there's the bog road, which essentially cuts right through the heart of Roundstone Bog, and that makes it very easy to come to appreciate the bog, and to do so without having to walk across the bog itself, or without risk of disturbing the habitats or causing disturbance to the wildlife present. So just taking a simple walk during the springtime when the dawn chorus is in full effect, it's a simply amazing place to be, to listen to the bird song, skylark and cuckoo and all the species that are living in and on the surrounding bog.
Roundstone Bog, it's an excellent example of kind of Atlantic, peatlands that are largely still intact, and they're a huge benefit to wildlife habitats, and even carbon. They're huge storage of carbon, which is obviously very important at the moment. And at the moment now in Ireland, there's a lot of bog restoration works being undertaken. Including some here in some pilot work being started here on the edge of Roundstone Bog, where sites of where turf cutting would have taken place, where the bog would have been drained, those are now going to be restored so that the bog will get back into a more healthy state, so it'll start to recapture carbon and hopefully act as a suitable habitat for breeding birds and other wildlife. People's appreciation of bogs is definitely changing. In the past, bogs would have been seen as, only a place for cutting turf or maybe even dumping or maybe burning bogs as well. And thankfully a lot of those activities now are waning or largely have gone now. So I think people are waking up to the gems that, that is Roundstone Bog, which is great to see.
We're so lucky to still have places like this left. This is our wilderness and it's so important for biodiversity. And we can see the benefits of protecting sites like these, both for ourselves and for nature. And Roundstone Bog should serve as an example of what we should strive for other peatland sites, to protect and enhance them, to have more areas like this.